Welcome everyone. I'm Elaine Grotefeld, a partner in the Vancouver office of Odgers Berndtson. I'm joined today by my good friend Robert Booker, who I'll introduce in a moment. COVID has certainly flipped our world upside down, and along the way, I think we've all been discovering some unexpected things about our organisations and ourselves. Given what we're hearing from so many of you, we thought it would be useful to hear from someone who experienced directly an extraordinary crisis several years ago, for which he himself will say he was woefully unprepared. Today we'll hear what happened, what he learned, and what changes resulted. Robert Booker. There's not much he hasn't done, all the way from being a trainee fighter pilot to being the CHRO of one of the world's largest oil and gas companies. Throughout his career, Rob has been dedicated to lifelong learning for his colleagues and for himself. Currently in Vancouver, he consults with organisations to help them with their learning programmes, and also is currently studying for his doctorate in organisational learning at Vanderbilt University. Welcome, Rob. Perhaps we can start with asking you to share your story. What happened?
Thanks, Elaine. It's good to see you, and I'm happy to be here. Well, my story goes back to 2010 when I was the CHRO at an oil and gas company. And I was looking after crisis management for a weekend when I received a call from our country manager in Tunisia. And all I could hear when I first picked up the phone was screaming in the background before the country manager came on and explained to me that the country was going through a revolution. And his immediate concern was that the prison next door to our camp had basically broken down and the prisoners had escaped and they were trying to get into our camp. He asked me for help. And as you say, I felt completely unprepared for this eventuality. I just didn't know what to do. But the muscle memory kicked in and I assembled the crisis management team in our office and we got together and quickly assessed what the risks were. And there were effectively two that were mutually exclusive. The first was that we had quite a large group of expatriate families in the country, and there was some concern that they might be politically valuable hostages. So that was something that played very heavily on my mind. And offsetting that was the fact that our gas plant produced 40% of the electricity in Tunisia. And we knew that if we just switched everything off and evacuated the expatriates, we could risk turning a revolution into a really disastrous event across the whole of the country. And I think it's safe to say that nothing in my background prepared me for dealing with this. The phone didn't stop ringing. People were calling me, begging me to evacuate people. Other people were calling, begging me to leave the gas on. And I just really didn't know what to do. But we put one foot in front of the other. And we initially started by chartering a plane to go into the country and rescue people. Now that's in itself an interesting experience. Chartering a plane to go into a crisis zone, not something I've done before, is very surreal. And I went from not knowing how to do it, 24 hours later having a plane on the ground. I had to decide to get additional security personnel, then I had to decide whether they should be armed or not. And none of these decisions were anywhere in any handbook or anything, so I just had to keep going. But you know, in the end, it was all very positive. We kept the gas flowing, kept the lights on in Tunisia, got all of our own people out, and even assisted some of our competitors and some government staff and getting them out of the country as well. So it was all very successful in the end.
Well, thank you, Rob. That's quite the story. Having been through an incredible crisis like that, what surprised you the most? And what did you learn from the experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Elaine. I mean, the surprise is probably the biggest thing. It's how radically everything changes. It really, the world as you know it just turns upside down, and all the things you go to ways of solving problems become unhelpful, actually. I think in terms of the things we learned, probably the first was that our organizational culture was critically tested. We were fortunate that we had a very strong safety culture in common with many other oil and gas companies. And so throughout our response, safety really came to the fore. And I think that was very positive. Now, I've subsequently studied other organizations going through crises, and I know that that's not always the case. And sometimes the organizational culture doesn't actually match what's happening on the ground, and that can be a problem. The second thing was perhaps a bit more personal to me, and that concerns communications. I tried really hard to communicate as frequently and as openly and as transparently as I could, but I still received the feedback that I didn't communicate enough. And I think that's a really important lesson for anyone going through this sort of situation. There's lots of people around in the organization who are trying to make sense of what's going on, and they value information from leadership far more than leadership might expect. So that was a big learning. We also had quite a significant impact on the organization. A crisis really shines a spotlight on inefficiencies and processes that perhaps aren't really necessary, but are just part of the organizational fabric. And we found that in reality, quite a few jobs could be completely re-engineered. In fact, some could be eliminated. But in a way, I've sort of saved the best learning to last, and that was how people responded. It really surprised me from a leadership perspective. We were quite disappointed with one or two, but on a much more positive note, the lasting takeaway for me was how people who I didn't even formally know at all really stepped up. They demonstrated incredible resilience. They demonstrated real wisdom and fantastic leadership skills. It was a really fantastic thing. When a crisis hits, you've nowhere to hide. You've got to get on and do the job. And these people really stepped up, and I didn't know them before. That was a big learning for me.
Incredible stories there, Rob, and learnings. Arab Springs, of course, very different crisis to COVID. No armed mercenaries in our crisis. And
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of these learnings resonate with many of us, nevertheless. Given all that you learnt during that very frightening crisis, what did you actually do about it when you emerged out the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question. We deliberately went through a learning process to say what did we actually learn, and can we be sure that it was factually correct and our learning is accurate. Picking up on my point about organizational processes, we did make some fairly fundamental changes to the way that some of the work was done. I think the crisis really helped us to see what was important and also what we were doing that was perhaps unnecessary. So we incorporated those changes permanently. Secondly, it was clear to me that capacity at the executive level is critically important. In a way, we were quite fortunate that this happened at a quiet time for us. If it had happened at a busy time at the executive level, we would have been heavily tested, I think. So executive capacity is important, and so that we added an extra role. And then picking up on my most important point, I think really this question of talent. As I mentioned, I was really pleased with how people stepped up, and it was a very positive feeling. But then it quickly was replaced by anxiety. I thought, well, all these wonderful people arrived on the scene from within our organization, but I didn't know about them. Who else is in our company that I don't know about? How are we picking up this talent? How are we proactively identifying and developing this talent? And once we've proactively identified and developed it, what are we actually doing to develop a range of skills that incorporate things like this crisis? How are we equipping people with the skills necessary to respond positively to a crisis like this in the future?
So, Rob, could you share a couple of specific examples around that?
Yeah, sure. So on the talent identification, we had a 360-degree feedback tool that we were using. We were effectively just trialing it in the organization at this time. As I say, we're going back a few years now. But our primary method for talent identification was manager-subordinate recognition, effectively. So a manager would say, hey, this person's pretty good, you should take a look at them, put them in the talent management system. What we were not doing was picking up peer-to-peer feedback. And as a result of this crisis, I realized that actually peer-to-peer feedback is far more reliable and far more valid than we'd previously given it credit for. So we basically fundamentally changed our talent identification process, turned it on its head, and incorporated peer-to-peer feedback as the primary driver for talent identification. And subsequently, it was extremely successful. We identified some wonderful people. And then relatedly, I realized, as I mentioned, that the development program was not fit for purpose if the purpose was going to include future crises. So we made some fairly radical changes to our development program. We worked with a couple of wonderful universities and incorporated some form of crisis management training as part of that development program.
Did you manage all of these initiatives internally, Rob, or enlist some outside help?
Well, I think it's really important to lead the learning process internally. I think it's a really fantastic skill for an organization to develop, to go through and separate fact from opinion and collect information and work out what the changes should be. But I think it's also important to get some external help. I particularly relied on actually the search consultant that I was using as a way of testing if my assessment of people who in particular had underperformed, whether my assessment of them was fair. You know, you don't want to be harsh, you don't want to judge people. And my search consultant had a wide range of experience from different industries, different sectors, different geographies. And I was able just to sort of bounce ideas off him, if you like, and say, look, I've seen this, is this fair? Am I being reasonable? Is my assessment correct? And that was incredibly helpful. And as I mentioned, we got some help in our development program from universities, from one in particular that was very impressive, an American organization. We also got some help on the talent identification side. It won't surprise you to hear me say that one of the things I really wanted to know was, is there a predictive mechanism for identifying leadership capability? And we found that there were tests that we could introduce that really helped us, once we'd identified people, assess them to see whether they did have that leadership potential. So that was very helpful. And then finally, we did actually hire an additional person to support the executive team, bringing in that capacity that I was talking about. We brought in a senior executive who could really challenge our thinking. You know, if we look back, the Arab Spring was probably predictable, but we missed it. And so I think that bringing that extra person in and challenging us on our thinking was really designed to help us identify things before they arose.
Yeah, all very interesting points. Rob, before we close today, any parting comments or words of advice?
Yeah, look, I think I've touched only on a very small scratch of the surface here. There was a lot of work and we've summarized it into just a couple of minutes. But I think that this crisis really provides an opportunity for organizations to really reflect and learn about themselves, question their corporate culture, question their leadership, both good and bad, and incorporate those into making the organization more successful in the future. Identify changes and actually follow through and make them happen. I mean, that would be my recommendation.
Well, Rob, this has clearly been a really impactful time in your life and your career. So thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Elaine. Always a pleasure.
Well, that's all we have time for today. But if any of you have any follow-up questions for Rob or Odgers Berndtson or myself, please reach out and let's continue the conversation. Thank you for joining.